Today, this is all that remains of the medieval monasteries that for centuries represented the medieval England of a once Catholic and united Europe. These shells, these empty skeletons, represent a time when England was a superstitious and feudal land, a place of piety and humility before a common faith. A faith rooted in the Pope, the head of Catholicism in Europe and one-time representative of God on earth. These decayed remnants did not come, however, to their present state through neglect, but rather through a deliberate and calculated plunder. Their destruction came about not through any organic change in religious thinking in England, nor did the majority of people in England welcome such a change. And yet today we look at them and wonder what, if anything, can be salvaged from the sight of such a forlorn monument. To me, the English Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries conjures up images of a phoenix rising from the ashes. Although the elites undoubtedly profited greatly from the dissolution of the monasteries, and many people at court became very wealthy as a result of them, the English people were able to develop in their own unique way also. It wasn't just the elites that changed their way of thinking. People throughout the whole of Tudor England were thinking in a different way. For the first time, people were able to disseminate information and read for themselves in English the Bible. This was something that Henry VIII and his chief advisors could never have envisaged when they undertook to dismantle the Catholic Church in England. This revolution came about at the beginning of the English Renaissance, a time of change and modernisation. It became fashionable to consider England's destiny as that of a great power, no longer the backwater of Europe, and to chart an independent course that would make her a rival to France and Spain and any prince of Europe who dared to try and invade the borders of England's realms. Was this explosion in free expression and thought a mere accident? Did Henry VIII plan for this to take place? Did Henry envisage an imperial power in the form of England? Well, yes, he did. He believed entirely in the idea of England becoming an imperial nation, a world power. But he could never have known just how powerful England would become. In fact, it was his daughter, Elizabeth, who sowed the eventual seeds of empire. England was ahead of its time. There were many powerful people at court who were willing to engage in intrigues on behalf of evangelical bishops who were reform-minded and wanted to implement Protestantism into the new Church of England, which Henry VIII had made himself governor of. This all came about simply because of his inability to father an heir with his wife Catherine of Aragon. And so we go back to 1528, when Henry VIII became acquainted with Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, brother-in-law to the powerful Duke of Norfolk. She had been travelling in the foreign courts of Europe, where she had been learning etiquette since her childhood. During her time in France and Flanders, she had become acquainted with religious writers who had been inspired by the firebrand Protestant preacher Martin Luther. Her time abroad had also given her a good education, and she had been absorbed by the Protestant rhetoric that was becoming influential at the time. Her father had intended that she return to England, where he could present her at court and hopefully attract the interest of some powerful courtier or noble to whom he could marry his daughter in order to bring prestige and connections to the Boleyn family. Her continental education seems to have paid off, because when she returned to England, she was immediately noticed by George Cavendish, who said this about her: "Her excellent gesture and behaviour excels all others, insomuch as the king began to kindle the brand of amours, which was not known to any person, nay, scantly to her own person." Upon her return to England, Anne had become one of Queen Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, and the king had quickly noticed her. Courtiers began to speculate that he would take her as his mistress. Indeed, he had already done that with her sister, Mary. However, it soon became apparent that there was a rival for Anne's attention. Henry Percy, son of the Earl of Northumberland, had entered into a pre-contract to marry Anne, and intended to do so. George Cavendish again recalled the scandal with these words: "Lord Percy would resort for his pastime to enter the Queen's chamber, and there would fall in dalliance with her ladies in waiting, being most conversant with Mistress Anne Boleyn, so that there grew such a great love between them, that at length they were insured together, intending to marry. The which thing came to the king's knowledge, who was then much offended, wherefore he revealed his secret affection for her unto my Lord Cardinal, and consulted with him to infringe the pre-contract that had existed between them." It appears as though Anne was very much in love with Percy, but Henry nevertheless ordered Cardinal Wolsey to get rid of him. Wolsey summoned Percy and gave him a public dressing down. "I wonder not a little at thy peevish folly, that thou would entangle oneself with Anne Boleyn, that foolish girl of the court. Dost thou not consider the state that God has called you unto in this world? For after the death of thy noble father, thou art most likely to inherit and possess one of the worthiest earldoms in this realm. But now, behold what you have done through your wilfulness. You have not just offended your natural father, but also your most gracious sovereign lord, the king." In Tudor times, offending the king usually resulted in losing your head, and so this dressing down by Wolsey was terrifying to Percy. He was banished from court and married off to a lady of the court, eliminating him as a rival to the king for Anne's affection. Anne was incensed by this and swore to get her revenge on Wolsey. He had no idea at this stage just how powerful an enemy Anne would turn out to be. In 1528, the Spanish ambassador to London wrote a coded letter to Emperor Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and the nephew of Queen Catherine of Aragon. "The king has secretly assembled certain bishops and lawyers that they may sign a declaration to the effect that His Majesty's marriage to the Queen is null and void, on account of her having once been his brother's wife." Mendoza's information was correct, and Henry convened a secret trial at his London residence to determine if there was a case for a divorce. He tasked Wolsey with heading this court, and the cardinal set to work. The entire case was based upon a single line in the Bible's book of Leviticus, which read, "If a man should take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless." Despite Henry's infatuation, his theological proof, and the support of several of his courtiers, the king came up against significant opposition to his plan to remarry. There were several influential people who were against the divorce, including Bishop John Fisher and Henry's own childhood friend, Sir Thomas More. Although More was a scientist and a thinker, he was a die-hard Catholic and considered his friend, the king's actions, to be heresy, as he pointed out to the king that the Pope had issued a special dispensation when he had married Catherine in the first place, thus overriding the line in Leviticus that Henry considered responsible for his lack of an heir. But Henry VIII was not to be trifled with, and he would stop at nothing to secure the succession to his crown and to acquire Anne Boleyn. And so the king's great matter was brought before the Pope. Wolsey dispatched Stephen Gardiner to Rome to speak with Pope Clement. The diplomat thought that his mission would be relatively simple, but events beyond the control of the English crown soon doomed the venture to failure, with dire consequences. Little did Henry know that the Pope had become the prisoner of Charles V's forces in Italy, which had just looted and occupied Rome. The Pope was reluctant to deal with the case under those circumstances, and delayed hearing the case, much to the intense annoyance of Henry. Despite being a prisoner, the Pope was sympathetic to Catherine, and had no intention of granting Henry his wish. Wolsey became nervous and requested that he be given the authority to make a judgment in England, thus making the Pope redundant. The Pope allowed Wolsey to try the case in England, albeit jointly with his own representative, Cardinal Campeggio. Thus a long and drawn-out legal battle seemed likely, and European power politics would make any divorce that much more difficult for Wolsey to secure. Next time, we will look at the obstacles to the King's great matter and understand why Henry took it upon himself to sever England's ties with Rome and make himself the supreme head of the Church of England.